Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a video where I'm talking about the books that I didn't expect to love this year. I read all of these and I expected to give them around a 3-star rating, but for all intents and purposes I gave them higher than that. So let's get into my first pick. The first one is The Ghosts of the Tsunami by Richard Lloyd Parry, and this is a true story. So it's a journalist, Richard Lloyd Parry, who has gone to Japan and chronicled the tsunami survivors. So it was a great natural disaster, and this is usually not inside my wheelhouse whatsoever. I'm very hard fast into sci-fi and fantasy, and my friend recommended this one to me as one that I would probably like just because it was so detailed and heavy and it had a very strong tone, and she was really correct. It definitely left an impact on me, especially as I have recently traveled to Japan and I've understood the culture as experiencing it myself when I was traveling. So it was quite a hard-hitting book, obviously, which is to be expected. It's about a natural disaster and a lot of death and destruction, but it's also about the community that builds everything back up again afterwards. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it. You have to be very clear about what you're going into before you start it, but in terms of the writing and the accuracy and the history, it's just a very rich book. And so if you're wanting to read something like that, then go and pick it up, because I'm glad that I read it, even though it's not usually something I would pick up in general. And then the next book is one that I've mentioned in a video or two here and there in the past, and it's It Sounded Better in My Head by Nina Kenwood. This is a story about Natalie. She has just finished high school in Australia. She's 18 years old. She's waiting on her university offers to come through. And while she's waiting, she's on summer holidays. And so she has this kind of accidental romance with this guy. She's never been in a relationship before. Her two best friends are in a relationship with each other, so she's navigating that friendship. So this is all about identity, relationships, anxiety, and growing up as well, and I really enjoyed this story. It didn't take itself too seriously. It was quite funny. I don't usually go into contemporary books, let alone kind of young adult to new adult contemporary books, and I didn't expect much from this, in the sense that I knew that it wasn't my kind of read usually, so I just expected it to be an okay book and give it a 3 stars and go, hey, this is a good book, read it if you like, but it's not my favorite. But it ended up making my favorite books of 2020 video, and it definitely surprised me. I'm very grateful that it did, because with a cover like this that's quite out there, I was expecting it to stand out in my memory, and thankfully it did, because I enjoyed this quite a lot. It also has the there was only one bed trope, which is one of my favorite tropes ever in books, just because it is so wholesome and cute and funny, and it makes for such interesting character interaction. So that was a key trope in this, so if that's a trope that you love as well, I think you'll really enjoy this one like I did. Next is a book by Robin Hobb, and this is an author that I love, as evidenced by the books behind me, and I read all of her Elderlings books. However, I hadn't read one of her novellas, and that is The Willful Princess and the Pieboard Prince. I do have a physical copy, but it's not behind me, it's on my bookshelves at home, otherwise I would hold it up to show you. But this is a novella following events before the Farseer trilogy. So in the Farseer trilogy, the first book is Assassin's Apprentice. It's where I encourage people to start with this series overall. In that book, there are 2 kinds of magic users. One of them has the skill, one of them has the wit. Both of them are telepathic magics with different strengths. And the skill is a people-to-people magic, and the wit is an animal-to-person magic. So people have animal familiars, they have a blood bond and that kind of thing. And when someone has this bond with an animal, they start to trade kind of personality types. So the animals obviously become more intelligent, so they have a more humanness, intelligence about them, but they still keep their natural instincts. And so because the human changes them, it's an equal bond, so the animal changes the human as well. So the people in this world viewed this as quite dirty and taboo and forbidden. So in the Assassin's Apprentice books, it's something that's looked down upon. But in this novella, this is all set before this even happened. So that's what it kind of explores in one facet, but I believe it's about a wet nurse who takes care of the royal babies. And so she makes her daughter the wet nurse for the princess, I think. And so this girl has to go through the psychological beats and life events effectively that this princess goes through. So it was really interesting in terms of character, and I'm a very character-driven person, and so Robin Hobb writes that detail so incredibly well. I expected to give this about a 3 stars just because it was about characters that I didn't really know, I didn't really care about, and it was about a story that happened before all of the characters and the plot, again, that I cared about. So I didn't expect to love it very much. but I think I read it during April for the Owls readathon, and I ended up giving it a 4 or 4.5. I can't remember now, but it was definitely in the 4s. And I pleasantly quite enjoyed this. I was very invested in the characters. I think one half I liked more than the other half just because of the specific events in the book and because of the specific character building. But either way, I really quite enjoyed it. And if you haven't read it yet and you're a Robin Hobb fan, I would encourage you to read it. If you want to get a taste of her writing, you could read this. It is a decent place to start, but I would recommend reading the Farseer trilogy instead, because that is a place that everyone should start, and it's where you come to love and grow with the characters that we meet. Now, the next one on this list is also a contemporary book, and I kind of go into contemporary books expecting not to like them, and that might be why I'm consistently quite surprised, because Only Mostly Devastated, I expected this to be, you know, a young adult book that was kind of tiered for readers that are younger than me in my mid to late 20s, and I picked this up and was pleasantly surprised because not only did I get into Ollie, who is the character that we heard from in here, I understood his reasoning, his perspective, I understood his emotions. I was quite invested in this story, and it also made my favourites list of 2020. So if you haven't heard of this, this is the retelling of the musical Grease. It follows Ollie and this boy named Will, who he had like a summer fling for, and Ollie has been uprooted by his family, moved to a new state, I think, rather not country. It's definitely in the same country, it's a different state. And his aunt Linda has cancer, so his family are helping her out. And so because of this move and this upheaval in his life, he's got to go to a new school, and he ends up going to the same school as Will, and he runs into these girls who are like the pink ladies from Greece, and it kind of escalates from that point on because Ollie accidentally outs Will to his friends, and it doesn't go down a negative route, it goes down a friendship route and a solidarity route and a support route, and it's definitely about Ollie and Will kind of pivoting around each other, because Will, when he first sees Ollie come to the school, he doesn't really treat him like someone he used to care about, so there's that disparity to deal with as well. So I quite liked this. Again, I gave it a 5 stars. I didn't expect to give it a 5 stars, and I'm really happy that I read it, because if you don't go outside of your genre every now and again, how do you know that your favourite books aren't waiting elsewhere for you? So I'm really happy that I picked this one up and it sounded better in my head up, because they're just not really in the realms of books that I generally read. But because they were both Australian, I was like, you know what? I'm going to support local, I'm going to give them a try. And then sure enough, I ended up finding 2 books that I love. So it was a well worthwhile reading experience for me. I'm very happy. The next book on this list is an audiobook, and it is the last book in Libba Bray's series. So she wrote a young adult quartet called The Diviners, and The King of Crows is the book that I'm specifically putting on this list because it is a book that a lot of people, or I've seen a lot of fans go, oh, I didn't really love that as much as the previous books. And I kind of understand what they mean, because the third book in the series felt like it should be the last book in the series. It was really penultimate, it had a lot happening in it, and the things that happened to the characters were quite drastic, and I really liked that, and it made it feel very real and dynamic. But in the last book, because you'd already had that pinnacle of emotional development and action, I guess, in the series, it didn't really measure up as much in the 4th book, where it should have been placed instead. But I can see why it happened progressively, if that makes sense. It made sense for the story to do that, obviously. But in the last book, I gave it a 4. I didn't expect to. I thought I'd give it like a 2.5 or 3 stars based on comments and reviews I'd seen of the last book. But I really enjoyed it. It was consistent with character, it was consistent with plot. It ended in a way that was interesting but also satisfying. So I don't really have any overall criticisms with it, except that the pace was a little bit up and down, but that's really the only thing. And this is a series that follows Evie. She is one of the main characters. It grows with each book, and she has a discretion in her town, so she is shipped off by her family to live with her uncle Will, and Will runs a museum of the supernatural. It's very convoluted sounding, but I promise it's really easy to follow. And Evie has a clairvoyant ability, and she can touch objects and read their histories. So there are a bunch of other characters in here that have divining kind of abilities. They vary from Evie's, and they have multiple perspectives in each book, and they kind of all run into each other at different points in the story. So I love seeing their interactions. I love seeing how their voices and their characterization is different depending on who you're reading from, and because of that it made it distinct, and that's why I finished the series. So I think I picked it up and finished it in 2020, so I'm happy that it crossed my radar and that I decided to pick up the audiobooks because they were wonderful. So I would recommend if you want to listen to the audiobooks. So next is a book that has a lot of hype surrounding it, and it's been negatively tiered in a way because I'm talking about A Little Life by Hanya Yangahira. I always get that name wrong, so I'm really sorry, but I promise I try each time. This is a story about Jude and his college friends, and there's about 4 of them. They go to college together, but it's also following them after that as well, like a decade or so after that. And so it follows them growing up, and they have very dysfunctional relationships. They've all got very dysfunctional mental health as well. And this is a story that people describe as torture porn, and I can see exactly why, because there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Therapy is not looked at as something productive, and they just get deeper and deeper into this well of despair, and you see it all play out. And at one point I was reading it and then I put it down and I thought, I need to know what happens. And that's when I knew that it would be more than a 3-star rating for me. I do have a reading vlog where I chronicle my talking about it, and it's all spoiler free, and you can see the ups and downs that I'm experiencing with the book in that vlog. And I actually took some days off reading books in general after I finished that, just because it was so heavy. So if you're hesitant about starting it, then probably don't, but I had it on my shelves for a long time. I don't really have any triggers, but I do obviously empathize with characters, and so what they're going through I generally also connect to and feel. So it depends on what kind of reader you are. It's way outside my wheelhouse, but I picked it up because it was quite popular, it was quite hyped up, and because it's literary fiction, I thought I might get something from it because I was a literary studies major, but it was good. But I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it because I feel like that's the wrong kind of descriptor, if that makes sense. So I'm glad I read it. I will be keeping it, but I don't think I'm at this point going to reread it just because it was so dark and heavy. I would like to look into some essays about it though, because I think those would have merit. Now that I understand the context and the plot and the characters, I would like to look at analyzing it, if that makes any sense. But I don't know if it would give me more value from rereading it. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but my point is that that's been on my TBR for like 3+ years and I finally finished it. And next is a book that is kind of a mishmash because it's one of my favorite genres, but it's also one of my least favorite genres. So I'm talking about The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, and this is a book that is an alternate history, which I don't like historical fiction, but it's also sci-fi. So it talks about space travel, and our main characters are in the 50s, I believe, and they experience a meteor hit Earth and basically destroy like thousands of people. And this has ramifications on not only the population and the things we get from the land, but it also had ramifications on the environment in general. So they're trying to navigate that. The characters that we follow are part of NASA. So the woman we follow, I can't even remember her name because when I read audiobooks, names are the first thing to go. They just leave my head. And this was in like a first person, I think. So her name only got mentioned a couple of times. So that's probably also why I don't remember. But I am keen on finishing the trilogy because I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. I also gave it a 4 stars, and Mary Robinette Kowal narrates it herself, and she's also an audiobook narrator as a profession, and she does an incredible job, obviously because she knows where her characters are coming from. And so because of that experience of it, and because of the nuance that she wrote it under, it was a very enriching reading experience. She examined racism, and she examined patriarchy, and she examined anxiety and mental health and taking medication for mental health, and she managed to do it all in a way that was detailed and enriching and intriguing and also healthy in the way that it was communicated. And what I love most about this series is the partnership in it. So it's a husband and wife duo. They are a team. They don't have miscommunication to drive the plot forward. They communicate with each other, they support each other, but they also have their own struggles naturally as two people in a relationship would. And while that's going on, they've also got to acknowledge the outer state of the world that's happening at the same time, and also their careers, which I really liked. It was very multi-layered, so that's why I want to continue reading it, even though historical fiction isn't really my thing, because it was mixed with talk about space travel and the themes that I mentioned. I ended up really liking it. And then I've only got 2 more. So the next one is Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This is a graphic novel that I put off because I was an art snob. I was into Saga and Paper Girls, basically the stories by Brian K. Vaughan that have really intricate line work and very specific color detail. But then I picked up Heartstopper and I was like, what was I on about? This is amazing art. It looks simplistic, but it's really emotive and descriptive. And so if you're putting it off, please don't, because it is the cutest thing ever. And I'm so happy that I read it. It's about Charlie. He's in high school, and this follows a high school romance of him falling for this boy named Nick. Nick is on the rugby team and he's not a gay guy. So Charlie's like, oh God, I've got a crush on this straight guy. What do I do? And they just become friends, and their relationship is so wholesome. They also don't rely on miscommunication. They don't rely on negative romance tropes, if that makes sense. So there's no like manipulation, there's no guilt tripping, there's no pressure. It's just very cathartic and it's very communicative. It's also just adorable, and it's got such great character development in it as well. It touches on the negative stuff to make it realistic, but it also doesn't make that the linchpin of the story. So if you're wanting to get into this series, I would encourage you to don't put it off like I did, because I regret putting it off. Although I'm kind of glad that I didn't read it until now, because the 4th volume comes out next year in May. So if I read these earlier than I have, then I would have even longer to wait. So maybe wait until next year before it comes out in May and just like read all of them in a row, because I wish I kind of did that, because now I have so long to wait. But that is Heartstopper. The next one on my list is World War Z by Max Brooks. This is an apocalyptic fiction story, so it's definitely up my alley. Apocalyptic, sci-fi, and fantasy are my 3 favorite genres, fantasy definitely being the top tier one. But World War Z is kind of like a fictionalized history, so that's where I was kind of stumbling, and I ended up listening to it on audiobook, and that's where it became very enriching for me, because each story has its own audiobook narrator. So you've got your interviewer interviewing these key people who were part of the global apocalypse, and you'd see how they responded to their different scenarios, but in a reflective way. And because of the different narrators, it gave you more of a broader scope when listening to imagine things and imagine situations, and it connected you more to their characters, which I quite liked. So if you're struggling to read it physically like I was, read it on audiobook, because it's a very, very engaging experience. And I'm really glad that I stuck to it and read it, because my partner was like, you need to read it, because if you unhaul it, you'll regret it. And I'm glad I haven't unhauled it. I'm glad I stuck to my guns, and I'm glad I read it. So that is it for this video. These are the books that I didn't expect to love and only expected to give like 3 stars to, but all of them were at least a 4, if not 4.5. So I'm happy that I read these. I'm happy I branched out in some cases past my favorite genres, because it proved beneficial. So if you have a book that is outside of the genre that you usually read and you just can't get it off your radar, you keep hearing about it somehow, let me know down below, because maybe it's a book that I should have on my radar too. But thank you so much for watching this video. I will chat to you down in the comments, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.